guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing my summer seasonal TBR. This summer is definitely going to be a little bit hectic, but I still hope to read as much as I possibly can per usual. That being said, this summer is finally the time I should be wrapping up a rather long fantasy reread, so that can only mean one thing: new fantasy series to start. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the top books I hope to read this summer. So the first book on my list is a release from earlier this year that I have honestly been dying to read ever since I picked it up, and that is The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke. This is the first book to a new fantasy series, and the catchline is every empire demands a revolution. This is a dual perspective fantasy story that I also believe has a queer romance as well. Terrain is a soldier, and she was kidnapped as a child to kill and die for the empire. She only owes loyalty to her fellow conscripts, but when she's sent back to her homeland to quell a rebellion with her fellow unit, she quickly realizes that blood ties might be stronger than she initially realized. Enter in our other main character, Luca, and she is in need of a turncoat. Someone desperate enough to walk the bayonet's edge between treason and order. Someone who's willing to sway the rebels towards peace as well, but ultimately to achieve her final goal of taking her uncle off the throne through any means necessary. Espionage, murder, what have you. This seems to combine so many of my favorite things, from uprising and rebellion. It's set centrally in an empire story. I love that it's dual perspective and kind of bringing together two unlikely individuals. I'm hoping there's also romance. It just sounds really good. It has very strong early reviews. It's a debut that's been on my radar for quite a few months now, so I definitely want to get to this summer. The next book I just want to quickly get out of the way, as it definitely is the end of a very long reread journey, and that is Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. I am finally on this book. I'll be reading this book at the beginning of summer. I imagine it'll take me about 6 to 8 weeks depending on how quickly I'm able to get through it, but I plan to read the 4th installment within the Stormlight Archives. Don't get me wrong, while this reread has taken me a long time, I have fallen even deeper in love with this particular series. I love the multi-perspectives, just the escalation, the war, the intrigue. This seriously has it all. It's wild to think about how long I'm going to be committed to reading this series, as it's definitely going to take over, I think, a decade for all of the books to come out. But regardless, I'm finishing my reread and finally reading for the first time Rhythm of War this summer. With the finishing of Rhythm of War, I can finally move on and start a new, longer fantasy series, which I'm really looking forward to. And the first author I've decided to start with is Joe Abercrombie, with the first book being The Blade Itself. This is the first book to what I believe is a fantasy world that has many series set within it. It's grim dark and very character focused, which definitely calls out to me. I've heard such excellent things about Joe Abercrombie's writing, as well as this escalation of plots throughout this series. I don't really want to know too much about this going in. To be honest, the book itself is rather vague. There's not a very clear synopsis, but I hear this is bloody and gory and full of adventure. It also has kind of unconventional heroes, which really intrigues me as well. I don't know. I love Robin Hobb's character-led fantasy work, so I'm really hoping this will be a new favorite of mine, so I plan to read the first book sometime this summer as well. Next up is a bit of a shorter option, which I definitely feel like I need amongst the books I've already showed off, and that is The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. I picked this up last month, and honestly, ever since I grabbed it, I feel like it's been staring at me from my shelf. I don't know, something about the synopsis and just the elements of the story really intrigued me. This is a work of speculative fiction that kind of has a dystopian-esque setting. It's set on an unnamed island where items kind of disappear, and generally speaking, people tend to not notice when these disappearances happen, and in fact, if you do begin to notice, that kind of points to a larger issue for you and your family, particularly because there are individuals called the Memory Police put in place to ensure that the general populace does not notice when things begin to change around them. This follows our main character, who is a young writer, and she essentially realizes that her editor is in trouble, so she decides to hide her editor at her house, and essentially her writing is the only thing that can keep their memories safe. Again, this sounds dark, and I'm honestly just really captivated by that premise. This is a translated work and one that is internationally very popular. I don't know, I'm just looking forward to picking this up. I've also in general just been reading more speculative fiction this year, and I've really enjoyed that process and journey. They've all really kind of messed with my mind a bit, and it's been rather enjoyable. So I'm looking forward to picking this up and see if it screws with me as well. Next up shouldn't be too much of a surprise, and that is the Hod King by Josiah Bancroft. This is book 3 to the Sendlin Ascends series, which I started earlier this year and have absolutely fallen in love with. The 4th book comes out, I want to say, in the fall or winter, so I just want to ensure I am prepared for that release and I'm just able to pick it up right away when it comes out. But this is just such a dark and whimsical fantasy story that I've just fallen head first into and cannot stop reading or talking about. This is definitely one of my favorite series of 2021, and in general I would say it's really caught me off guard as well. It was not on my radar at all, but it has quickly just climbed the ranks of some of my favorite books out there. This is a fantasy story centering our main character Sendlin, who in book 1 travels to this place called the Tower of Babel, which is this mystical, kind of magical, giant tower contraption housing likely hundreds of thousands, millions of people, all kind of scattered across all of these different floors that make up the tower. Each floor kind of has its own distinct personality and vibe to it, but I would also say each floor is diabolical for its own reasons. Lots of politics and behind the scenes scheming, and the power of this tower is very unknown, if that makes sense. In book 1, Sendlin arrives fresh-faced and wide-eyed, very excited to live his dream with his wife and basically explore this tower together. However, once they arrive, he loses his wife. This journey to locate his lost wife is definitely the driving force through most of the series. However, I feel like the author does such a great job expanding the world, the characters, and just slowly providing us more information as you go along. The writing is excellent, the world is so imaginative and dark, and I've just fallen in love with it. So I definitely want to pick up book 3 at some point this summer, though I will say this is a rather longer installment, though I'm definitely not complaining, but I'm really looking forward to see how the story continues to evolve and expand, because it's been a wild ride so far. Next up is a middle grade option, and that is Amari and the Night Brothers by B.B. Alston. I'm honestly shocked I haven't read this book yet. Everything about the synopsis, I feel like this is going to be so much fun and a new fave for sure. I just think I haven't been reading as much middle grade over the winter and spring as I usually do, so I want to change that going into the summer. But this is the first book to a new middle grade fantasy story following our main character Amari. And she has never stopped believing that her brother Quentin is still alive, despite what everyone around her tries to tell her. So when she finds a ticking briefcase in his closet with an invitation for the summer tryouts for the Bureau of Supernatural Affairs, she's certain that the secret organization holds the key to what happened to her brother. So she decides to try out herself. Having to navigate fairies, aliens, magicians, and other supernatural creatures, Amari now fights for a spot to join the secret organization and is up against kids who have been preparing for this for their entire lives. This just sounds absolutely magical and whimsical. It seems to have a family component right at the heart of the story. Love that this has both a secret organization as well as a trial component to this story as well. I honestly just feel like I'm going to love this, and I also feel like it'll be a perfect book to kind of break up some of my heavier fantasy reads this summer, so I'm definitely going to be reading this in the coming months. Next up is a sci-fi option. I have been reading more sci-fi this year and it has been such a fun journey, so I want to ensure that I continue to do so throughout this next season, and the book I for sure want to pick up is Vagabonds by Hao Feng. This is a more recently translated science fiction story, but it's also one that is super popular internationally, and in general the reviews I've heard just make this book sound so good and very intense. The synopsis itself is very vague, and I've personally tried to avoid learning too much as it kind of gives the impression that this is a very intensely paced story, and it also has sort of a countdown component to it. At least that's how the synopsis presents us the information. But it basically says 2096, colonized Mars breaks away from Earth, beginning another Cold War, one based on the Iron Curtain of space. 2196, a delegation of young Martians, including the Council of Mars' granddaughter, sent to Earth for 5 years in an attempt for reconciliation. 2201, Luang and the other delegates return and find themselves no longer belonging to either Mars or Earth. As the prospect of war with Earth grows, Luang struggles to understand her grandfather's long-range design for a wet Mars and her role in the future unfurling before her. This just sounds so intense, as I said, a true political thriller, but I'm really fascinated by this sort of Mars versus Earth Cold War situation. I feel like this will definitely be a perfect summer page turner for me, so it's on the list. Last book that's on my summer TBR is American Gods by Neil Gaiman. This is a book I've known about for years, obviously, it's American Gods, but suddenly, I would say about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was struck with this strong desire to buy and read this book immediately. There was something about the synopsis, the idea, maybe I haven't read a Neil Gaiman book in a minute, that I just wanted to read this book right away, so I bought it, and I feel like that's definitely going to happen soon. But this is considered by many to be Neil Gaiman's most ambitious work, and overall the synopsis just sounds very intriguing. It's centering on a war between gods, but essentially this follows our main character Shadow, who at the beginning of the story was just recently released from prison. But after his release, he finds his world turned upside down. His wife has been killed and he no longer really has a home to return to. So when a stranger approaches him, offering him a job with nothing to lose, he decides to accept. However, a storm is brewing because beneath the placid surface of everyday life in America, a war is being fought between the gods, and the prize is the very soul of America itself. This just sounds so cool. I personally love God versus humanity, God versus God-based stories. I think it's one of my favorite tropes played out in fantasy. I'm always just intrigued by it. This is obviously a very beloved story. There's a television show that's very loved as well. So I feel like it's finally just time for me to pick up this Neil Gaiman novel. I've read many books by him and really love his writing style, but I have an inkling that this may be a new fave, but we shall see. But yes, it's time for me to read American Gods, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Alrighty guys, that is my summer TBR. Let me know down below some books you hope to get to this season, as I would love to know, and I will see you guys soon with another video soon. Goodbye!